The coffee cup trembled between her hands. 3 in the morning at Sacred Heart Hospital in Raleigh, fluorescent lights humming their electric hymn above the empty break room, and Hannah Clarke sat alone with lukewarm coffee and the kind of stillness that comes from learning not to move. Not from fear. From discipline. From 18 years of teaching her body that trembling was a luxury she couldn't afford. She pressed the cup against her palms. The warmth helped. The ceramic was chipped along the rim. She'd used the same cup for 3 years, ever since arriving in Raleigh with a duffel bag, 2 changes of scrubs, and instructions from a VA counselor to find somewhere quiet where no one would ask questions about Ramadi. Sacred Heart had been quiet enough. Anonymous enough. The kind of hospital where night shift meant you could heal patients without healing yourself, where no one investigated the soft-spoken nurse who volunteered for the graveyard rotation every single night. The cup made a sound against the laminate table when she set it down. A small clink. Deliberate. Controlled. She'd learned control the way most people learn to walk. Her hands were the kind of hands that hospitals didn't notice, calloused across the knuckles, a thin line of scar tissue running from her left wrist to her elbow, nails kept short and practical. They were hands that had held a surgical line alone for 11 hours in a military compound in Fallujah while rounds came through the windows. Hands that had pulled 13 soldiers from a burning Humvee in Ramadi before they shook so badly she couldn't hold a pen for 6 months afterward. Now those hands changed bedpans and checked blood pressure with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned that the smaller you made yourself, the less trouble found you. The break room's refrigerator hummed in the corner. 3 a.m. felt like the bottom of the world, the hour when every hospital went quiet and the people who worked nights became ghosts, moving through corridors where the living slept, keeping vigil over the dying. Hannah liked the night shift. The night shift didn't ask questions. The night shift didn't care if you wore your identification badge on a lanyard so worn the plastic had cracked, or if you brought the same photo in a plastic frame to your locker and never once mentioned what the photo showed. The photo was tucked behind her work schedule, half hidden by the laminated posting of next month's rotation. Her son, James. Army fatigues, his deployment photo from 8 months ago, date stamped in the corner, March 15th. He'd shipped out with the 75th Ranger Regiment to Fort Benning and then deployed forward, and for the first 3 months he'd called every other Tuesday without fail. New recruit excitement. Letters home. A video call where he showed her his bunk and his squad and the insignia on his uniform that matched the one he'd been bragging about since high school. That was before 6 weeks of silence. Hannah had learned not to think about the silence. She'd learned to focus on the work instead, the vitals to check, the medications to verify, the small mercies that kept people alive through the night. She pushed off from the break room table and moved back into the corridors of Sacred Heart, where the fluorescent lights cast everything in a shade of institutional white that made it impossible to tell if dawn was coming or if night had simply decided to stay forever. The 3rd floor was quiet. Most of the patients were asleep, monitors beeping their steady rhythm, O2 SATs holding, heart rate stable, nothing crashing yet. She moved between rooms with the kind of silence that came from practice, checking drips, adjusting pillows, writing notes in charts with a pen that didn't click. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air, underneath something older, something human and sick and trying to heal. She'd stopped noticing it years ago. Now it was just the smell of work. Room 314 had a patient post-op from hernia repair, doing well, vital stable, no signs of infection. She adjusted the 4-drip and made a note. Room 316 had an elderly man with congestive heart failure who'd been in and out of Sacred Heart for 3 years. She'd seen him through 2 myocardial infarctions and 1 valve replacement. His breathing was easier tonight. She squeezed his shoulder where he slept, not hard enough to wake him, just hard enough to let him know someone was watching. That's what nurses did when doctors slept. They watched. They remembered. They held the line. She was coming out of room 318 when she heard the paramedic radio crackle through the nurse's station speaker. Code 3 incoming. Male, mid-30s, unconscious, penetrating trauma to the thoracic cavity, bleeding controlled but not stopped, ETA 4 minutes. The night shift suddenly had weight again. Hannah moved without thinking. She'd done this 1,000 times, the small choreography of preparing a trauma bay, clean sheets on the bed, equipment positioned, charting already started with the information dispatch had given them. No ID, the paramedic said. No wallet. No way to contact family. Just a body and a wound and a set of vitals that were dropping steadily. The paramedic rig pulled up at 4:17 a.m. exactly. She heard the ambulance doors slam, heard the stretcher wheel squeaking against the wet asphalt outside. Rain had started sometime in the last hour, the kind of rain that came to North Carolina in the spring like an apology. She'd been a Navy medic long enough to know that rain on pavement sounded different than rain on sand. Sand absorbed. Pavement threw it back. They came through the ER doors like a controlled crisis, 2 paramedics guiding the stretcher, a fire medic doing compressions that looked more like maintenance than emergency, calling out vitals in the shorthand language of the field. Systolic dropping. Respiration shallow. Bleeding controlled but unidentified source. The patient was a man, mid-30s like they'd said, with dark hair matted against his forehead and a field dressing across his ribs that had been applied with the kind of precision that said military training. Hannah stepped forward to take the transfer, her movements automatic, the way a sailor moves on a ship in rough seas, always knowing where the next step is going to land. Dr. Sterling was still somewhere in the hospital, probably sleeping in the physician's lounge where he'd been since midnight, but that didn't matter yet. The first 10 minutes of a trauma were nursing minutes. Doctor minutes came later. She reached for the patient's chart as they wheeled him past the nurse's station, scanning the paramedic notes for allergies, medications, anything that might matter. No ID, they'd written again. No information. Male wearing military-issue t-shirt beneath field dressing. Military watch, Garmin Fortrex, the kind Special Operations Forces carried. And then Hannah saw the tattoo. It was on his left shoulder, partially visible as they shifted him from stretcher to hospital bed, the field dressing pulling back just far enough for her to see the 75th Ranger Regiment insignia. The scrollwork was fresh enough that the black ink still had the shine of something applied within the last year. Below it, a date she couldn't quite read. The room didn't stop. Hannah didn't stop. Her hands kept moving, kept working, kept doing the job she was trained to do. But something inside her dropped like a stone into black water. 75th Ranger Regiment. That was James's unit. That was the insignia he'd texted her a photo of 6 weeks ago, right before the calls stopped. Right before the letters stopped. Right before every night started ending at the same moment he would have called, if he was calling anymore. She was running the admit vitals while a paramedic finished his report, her fingers on the patient's wrist finding his pulse, fast, thread-thin, the rhythm of someone bleeding steadily from somewhere his field dressing hadn't found. His skin was clammy. Pale. The pallor of major blood loss or shock or both. She was supposed to stay focused. Stay professional. Stay silent. Instead, she let her eyes move to the tattoo again. The paramedic was already leaving, already moving on to the next call, the next body, the next family waiting somewhere for information they wouldn't get until morning. She was alone with the patient, alone in the bay except for the monitor tech who was running the initial EKG from the other side of the curtain. Alone enough to lean closer. Alone enough to let her finger hover near the tattoo without actually touching it. The wound across his ribs told a story. The entry wound was ragged, shrapnel, almost certainly, or fragmentation from something that had exploded near him. The field dressing had been applied by someone who knew what they were doing, someone who'd been trained in military medicine or emergency response. But there was secondary trauma around the edges of the dressing, bruising that suggested the original wound might be deeper than the visible laceration, that something was still bleeding underneath. She should call for Dr. Sterling. She should wait for him to come down and assess. She should do what she'd learned to do for 3 years at Sacred Heart, fade into the background, follow orders, ask quiet questions when she noticed discrepancies in charts, and accept with quiet dignity when she was dismissed. Instead, she carefully adjusted the field dressing to get a better look at the entry pattern. The patient's chest rose and fell with the mechanical rhythm of someone barely holding on to consciousness. His heart rate was climbing, 104, 108, 112. O2 sat dropping incrementally. The bleeding wasn't external anymore. It was internal. And looking at the location of the wound, the trajectory of the trauma, she was already calculating where the shrapnel might have settled. Already thinking about the structures it might have damaged. Already moving through the mental atlas of human anatomy that she'd learned not to access anymore. Her hand, the one with the scar from Ramadi, was the one that reached out. Her finger traced the edges of the wound pattern with the kind of precision that would have looked clinical to anyone watching, except Hannah's hands had stopped trembling. They'd stopped trembling the way a soldier's hands stop trembling when the incoming fire starts. When there's work to do. When the only choice is to function or fail. The 75th Ranger Regiment tattoo seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights. She thought of James in his dress uniform, telling her about the Rangers he'd be serving with. She thought of 6 weeks of silence. She thought of every night at 7 p.m. when he didn't call. Every morning she woke up checking her phone to find no messages, no letters, nothing. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that this patient was unconscious and unidentified and alive, and she had no way of knowing if he was someone who could tell her anything about James. No way of knowing if they served together. No way of knowing if this man in a 75th Ranger Regiment tattoo and military-issue clothing had been there 6 weeks ago when the silence started. And she realized, standing there with her trembling hands finally still, that she would have to wait to find out. Would have to stay professional. Would have to chart his vitals and monitor his bleeding and do exactly what nurses did, which was nothing. Absolutely nothing except watch and hope and remember to breathe. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. Rain hammered against the windows outside. And Hannah Clarke, Senior Chief Petty Officer, Navy Cross recipient, stood at the bedside of a stranger and felt her entire carefully reconstructed life begin to crack. Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway at 10:11 p.m., his timing too precise to be accidental. He'd been watching her. Hannah felt his presence before she turned, the way predators announce themselves without sound, a shift in air pressure, a shadow crossing fluorescent light. The John Doe lay unconscious still, his chest rising and falling with mechanical regularity, and Hannah's fingers had just finished tracing the shrapnel wound's trajectory when Sterling's voice cut through the quiet like a scalpel. Nurse Clarke seems more interested in examining tattoos than monitoring vitals. His words weren't whispered. They were projected, calibrated to carry down the corridor into 3 neighboring bays where the night shift was thin enough that everyone would hear. Perhaps she's forgotten which one of us went to medical school. Behind him stood a woman in her mid-20s, army dress uniform still creased from travel, her face already twisted with the particular anger of someone who'd been told her brother was stable and found him looking exactly like he might not be. The sister's eyes snapped to Hannah, searching for the guilt Sterling's tone had already planted there. Hannah took one measured breath. The kind of breath that came from 18 years of taking hostile fire and choosing the next move instead of the next emotion. She straightened, her hand stilling on the bed rail. When she spoke, her voice was level, not defensive, not apologetic. Just factual. I was checking wound patterns, doctor. The shrapnel trajectory suggests possible secondary fragments the initial imaging may have missed. Sterling smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd already won because he didn't need to be right, only louder. Of course you were, Florence. The nickname landed exactly where he'd aimed it, reducing her to archetype, to every cliched image of nursing that diminished the actual work into sentiment and hand-holding. He turned to the sister with theatrical concern. I apologize for the distraction. Let's discuss your brother's care with the actual medical team. The emphasis was so delicate, so precise, that only someone trained to hear the blade beneath could recognize it as a weapon. Hannah's jaw tightened. Heat climbed her neck, not fear, not shame, but the particular rage of someone watching a man commit malpractice while wearing it as virtue. She stepped back from the bed. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply returned to her assigned rounds with the same methodical precision she'd carried through a surgical line in Ramadi when the compound was the only defensible position and 43 lives depended on her hands not shaking. But her hands shook anyway. Not from fear. From restraint. The break room was fluorescent and cold when she found it 40 minutes later, her scrubs still damp where coffee had spilled during a difficult start on a pediatric patient in Bay 3. Four colleagues sat at the table: Sarah from nights, Miguel who worked ER registration, Dr. Chen from the last shift, and Lisa from radiology. They were mid-conversation, comfortable, the way people talk when they're safe. When Hannah sat down with her own cold coffee, the room shifted. Air pressure changed again, just like it had in the hallway with Sterling. Sarah glanced at Miguel first. Just a look. No words needed. Miguel stood, taking his uneaten sandwich with him. Then Lisa, gathering her badge and phone. Then Dr. Chen, offering no excuse, no apology, just the sound of his chair scraping back against tile. One by one they relocated to the hallway, their conversation resuming at full volume now that Hannah was alone. The silence that followed was the sound of institutional betrayal. Not dramatic, not violent. Just the quiet decision that associating with her had become strategically unwise. The coffee spread across the table in an irregular stain, same color as dried blood on surgical gloves. Hannah stared at it, watching the edge dissolve into tile grout, and felt something inside her recalibrate. This was how it worked. This was how good people became invisible, not through force but through consensus. One surgeon's public mockery. One look between colleagues. One hallway relocation. And you became someone others instinctively avoided, as if whatever Sterling had suggested about her might be contagious. She didn't cry. Not here. Not with the hallway still audible through the open door. She sat with her failing coffee and made a decision: she would wait until she was alone. By 7 a.m. shift change, the decision had been made for her. The unit board in the main corridor displayed names and assignments in dry erase marker, organized by shift and patient load. Under today's date, someone had added a new category, and Hannah's name appeared there in Sterling's precise handwriting. Performance concern, inappropriate patient boundary observation, formal written warning, supervisory review pending, Dr. Sterling, attending. The day shift nurses clustered around it, whispering. Their voices carried that particular frequency reserved for scandal, not shocked, but entertained. Hannah stood in the hallway reading the words, feeling every eye on her back, and recognized the moment she became untouchable. The women who'd borrowed her coffee pods, asked her advice on difficult patients, complimented her for technique, they would now start giving her distance. Not hostility. Worse. Professional courtesy that felt like rejection. She took one measured breath. Let a single tear trace her cheek as she turned to face Sterling in his office doorway. He was watching her from behind his desk, gauging her reaction, waiting to see if she would break. The tear fell as she held his gaze without flinching, without looking away, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing her damaged. She wiped it away. Slow. Deliberate. And spoke in a voice so quiet he had to lean forward to hear it. I was checking if he was someone's son, doctor, because that's what nurses do when doctors forget patients are human. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Sterling's smile returned, colder this time, edged with something that looked like respect and absolutely was not. How touching, he said, his voice smooth as glycerin. I'm sure HR will appreciate your dedication during your supervisory review. Hannah didn't respond. She simply turned and walked toward the exit, her badge already unclipped from her scrubs. She had 12 hours before her next shift. 12 hours to compose herself before returning to Sacred Heart, where everything had shifted. The hospital had been her refuge for 3 years, the place where no one knew Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke, where she could move through corridors in anonymity, healing what was broken in others while her own fractures remained private and sealed. Now the anonymity was gone. Replaced by a whisper that would follow her through every hallway, every break room, every moment she tried to do the actual work of nursing. She didn't know yet that the worst hadn't arrived. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was 18 hours still to come. The monitor flatlined at 6:44 a.m. 18 hours. That's how long the Ranger had held on after Hannah stitched the initial wound, after Sterling's rushed CT scan missed the secondary fragment, a shard of steel lodged between the pericardium and the heart itself, slowly bleeding into the space around it. Pericardial effusion. The blood wasn't draining. The pressure was crushing his heart like a fist closing around a bird. The code team scrambled into ICU Bay 3. 3 nurses. 2 residents. Sterling pushing through the swinging doors with the confidence of a man who'd never failed at anything that mattered to his career. The attending physician, Dr. Reeves, a woman with 30 years of trauma experience, was already at the bedside when Hannah arrived with the crash cart. BP 72/40 and dropping, one of the nurses called out. O2 sat 68. He's in tamponade. Sterling moved toward the patient with a 14-gauge needle in his trembling hand. His jaw was tight. His breathing shallow. He'd already made one critical mistake on this case. He wasn't about to let Hannah anywhere near his second chance to fix it. "Okay, let's decompress," Sterling said, his voice trying for steady and missing by half an octave. "I'll need a subxiphoid approach," Hannah said quietly from across the bed, not a question, a statement of fact. Her hands were already moving, gathering a fresh needle, an empty syringe, the necessary equipment. He's been bleeding into the pericardium for hours. The tamponade's compressing his ventricle. Sterling's eyes found hers. A flash of something, fear, maybe, or recognition of what he was about to admit by needing her help. "Doctor, if you can't place it, I can assist," Hannah said. Her voice had dropped into the register it took on when she was calm. The register it took on in Ramadi when buildings were collapsing and people were dying, and her hands had to be steadier than the ground beneath them. Sterling's face flushed the color of raw meat. "Step back, Nurse Clarke. This is not your..." The monitor flatlined. The steady beat that had been the ranger's heartbeat 3 seconds ago simply ceased. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's mechanical wheeze, the urgent whisper of rubber gloves snapping onto hands, the small wet sounds of a body beginning to die. "We're losing him, Sterling. Do it. Do it now," Dr. Reeves barked. Her eyes flicked to Hannah. Not a request. Not a suggestion. A command that transcended protocol and ego and hospital hierarchy. Hannah was already moving. She took the needle from Sterling's shaking hand. He didn't resist, couldn't resist, because the ranger was flatlining and resistance meant a young army ranger would die in the next 60 seconds, and positioned herself at the subxiphoid angle, the point just below the xiphoid process where the pericardium lived beneath the ribs like a second skin around the heart. The angle was critical. 2 degrees off and you'd rupture the right atrium. 2 degrees the other direction and you'd miss completely and the patient would die while you were searching. Hannah's hands didn't shake. They never did. Muscle memory took over, hands that had done this 11 times in Ramadi with mortar fire walking up the building around her, hands that had performed this procedure while crouching behind a burning Humvee because the medical compound was the only defensible position and 13 Army Rangers were bleeding out and no one else could do it. Her hands remembered the angle like they remembered breathing. She advanced the needle with practiced fluid confidence, felt it penetrate the chest wall, felt it slide past the tissue planes, and then, the subtle change in resistance as the needle reached the pericardium itself. She drew back on the plunger just slightly, felt the give, and then the syringe was filling with dark blood. Not red. Dark. Blood that had been oxidizing in the pericardial sac for hours, blood that had been slowly suffocating the ranger's heart from the outside. 60 cubic centimeters. The needle came free. The monitor beeped once. Then twice. Then the rhythm came back, not strong, not yet, but present. Sinus rhythm. The numbers climbed, oxygen saturation rising from 68 to 72 to 80 to 90. Blood pressure stabilizing from 72/40 to 84/56. The ranger's pupils responded to light. His fingers twitched. The code team exhaled. Sterling stared at Hannah across the bed like she'd just materialized from some other dimension, like the nurse he'd been systematically dismantling for the past 8 hours had revealed herself to be something he didn't have the framework to understand. His face moved through shock, then something that looked like recognition, then something darker, rage, yes, but underneath it something worse, the fury of a man watching his control slip through his fingers. The ranger stabilized. Transfer to ICU step down, nurses already coordinating with the step down unit, Dr. Reeves writing orders in real time. Hannah stepped back from the bed, her scrub still dry, her breathing still even, her hands already moving to document the procedure because that was her job, that was always her job, to be the person who worked in the space between the visible and invisible. Sterling didn't stay. He left the ICU bay before the transfer team even arrived, left through the swinging doors moving fast, and Hannah heard him in the hallway 30 seconds later, his voice sharp and urgent into his phone. Yes, hello, this is Dr. Marcus Sterling from Sacred Heart's ER department. I need to report a serious violation of clinical protocols. Immediate investigation required. A nurse performed an invasive physician-only procedure without supervision or authorization. Yes. I have documentation. This is grounds for termination and license review with the state board. The fluorescent lights hummed their steady song. The ventilator wheezed. The monitor beeped its regular rhythm, the ranger's heart, working again, unaware that Hannah had just bought him a future with hands that the hospital was about to decide were too dangerous to trust. By 2:15 a.m., a hospital board member named Jonathan Pierce arrived in his silk tie and tailored blazer, summoned from his sleep by a phone call he took in his car while his wife texted complaints about the timing. By 6:53 a.m., an attorney with a mahogany briefcase came through the employee entrance with Sterling's documentation in hand, photographs of Hannah at the bedside, notes about her position, Sterling's timeline of events that positioned her intervention as a violation rather than what it actually was, the only thing that had saved the ranger's life. Hannah sat in HR at 8 a.m. Patricia Voss, the HR director, was a thin woman with kind eyes and hands that trembled slightly when she opened the termination protocol. She'd worked at Sacred Heart for 19 years and had never had to fire someone over something like this. The room smelled like industrial coffee and paper and the faint antiseptic tang that lived in every corner of the hospital, in the walls, in the ventilation, in the spaces between the molecules of air itself. Dr. Sterling has documented the incident, Patricia said quietly, her eyes not quite meeting Hannah's. His statement is clear. The pericardiocentesis is a physician-only procedure. Even in emergency circumstances, the protocol is to call the attending immediately, not to take action independently. I did call the attending, Hannah said. Her voice was steady. The voice of someone speaking facts. Dr. Reeves directed me to proceed. Dr. Reeves states that in the chaos of the code, she doesn't recall giving explicit authorization, Patricia said, reading from the document. She acknowledges that you may have believed that was occurring, but... Hannah said nothing. She could have told them about Ramadi. She could have explained that she'd performed this procedure 37 times in her career, that her hands knew the anatomy better than most residents who spent 6 years in medical school, that the patient would have been dead in 4 minutes without intervention. She could have told them about the 11 hours holding a surgical line alone while the medical compound absorbed intermittent fire, about the 13 Army Rangers she'd pulled from the burning Humvee, about the way her eyes had learned to see what the textbooks called the anatomy and what her muscle memory called the difference between life and death. But that would mean explaining who she was. And explaining who she was meant revealing why she'd left. So Hannah signed the termination paperwork at 8:48 a.m. She accepted the severance package. She listened to Patricia explain the impact on her nursing license, the mandatory report to the state board, the investigation that would begin within 48 hours. Your family? Patricia asked gently as Hannah stood to leave. No family in North Carolina, Hannah said. It wasn't a lie. Her family thought she was 2 hours away in Charlotte, working hospital administration. They had no idea she was in Raleigh because they had no idea why she needed to disappear. James had stopped calling 6 weeks ago, and she hadn't answered before that because the sound of his voice, the sound of someone who still believed she was strong, had made the damage feel too real. Security escorted her to her locker at 12:04 p.m. Hannah cleared it methodically, her personal badge holder, a photograph of James in his Ranger fatigues from his graduation ceremony 8 months ago, the pair of worn combat boots she kept in the bottom boots from her last deployment to Ramadi, boots that had walked through burning buildings, boots that had carried her from one operating table to another with mortar fire walking the rooftop above her head. The boots went into the cardboard box last. Her locker cleared. Her badge deactivated with a soft beep at the main door. Her 17-year career as a nurse ending at the moment her card stopped working. The parking lot at noon was beginning to fill with morning shift staff arriving. Some of them saw her walking out with the box. Some of them knew. The word would travel through the hospital in the way that hospital words always did, magnified, distorted, turned into gossip, the nurse who'd overstepped, who'd performed a procedure she wasn't qualified for, who'd put a patient at risk, who'd crossed the line that kept hospitals functioning and doctors in charge. Hannah set the box in the passenger seat of her 2009 Honda Civic and drove out of the parking lot. The rain had started, not heavy, just persistent, the kind of rain that hammered the windshield like applause for a performance no one was supposed to see. The rain kept coming as Hannah drove home, the kind of persistent downpour that turned the world into a series of blurred red taillights and squeaking windshield wipers. 3 days later, she was still wearing the same grey sweatshirt, the one with a hole near the cuff she'd been meaning to mend. The apartment was silent in a way that felt deliberate, not peaceful, but empty. Her phone sat on the kitchen counter where she'd left it, screen dark. No messages. No calls. On the fourth morning, she forced herself to shower. The water was hot enough to sting, and she watched the steam rise like something trying to escape. Her hands were steady as she dressed, muscle memory from years of dressing for shifts that would never come again. The mandatory PTSD intake appointment at the VA hospital was at 2 p.m. The referral had been automatic when she'd been terminated, hospital policy, they'd said, as if she were a liability to be processed. The VA facility in Durham was 23 minutes north. Hannah drove in silence, no radio, just the whisper of tires on wet asphalt. The parking lot smelled like diesel exhaust and wet concrete. She sat in her car for 7 minutes before opening the door. The waiting room was a landscape she'd moved through 1,000 times in uniform, but never as a patient. The chairs were blue plastic, mold and worn smooth by years of wait. 3 older veterans occupied them, a man with a Vietnam-era baseball cap and a prosthetic left leg, a younger Marine with scars that mapped his jaw like a topographic chart, a woman with lieutenant's eyes and trembling hands that reminded Hannah of her own 6 months ago. They glanced at her civilian clothes, the soft cardigan, the jeans, the absence of any identifier, and looked away. Hannah filled out the intake forms in silence. Name. Rank. Service dates. Reason for visit, occupational termination and loss of identity. The pen hovered over the field for 15 seconds before she wrote it. The waiting room was warm in that artificial way of government buildings, overheated and recirculated. Someone's coffee sat cooling on the side table, untouched. The fluorescent lights above didn't hum so much as drone, a sound she'd learned to filter out in 1,000 hospital corridors. Now it was all she could hear. The young Marine with the scarred jaw kept staring at his own forms. His hand shook when he turned the pages. Hannah recognized it, not fear, but the tremor that came from muscle memory meeting emptiness. He'd built himself for something, once. Now he was here, like she was, being catalogued and assessed. A nurse called her name at 2:38 p.m. Hannah rose and followed. The hallway was narrower than the ones at Sacred Heart, the walls a shade of beige that looked like it had been chosen to be forgettable. At home that evening, she sat in her car in the parking lot for an hour after the intake appointment ended, engine off, watching the sun collapse behind the building. The therapist had been competent, professional, clinical, which meant kind in a way that felt like it was meant for someone else. "We'll develop a treatment plan," the woman had said, and Hannah had nodded, and nothing had changed. She'd lost the Navy when she walked away. Lost the career that came after. Lost her son when he'd stopped calling. Lost her job 3 hours after she'd saved a life. What identity remained? Not a nurse. Not a medic. Not a mother. Not even close to whole. The next morning, she forced herself back to Sacred Heart for the termination clearance. Her badge still worked, They hadn't deactivated it yet, and she moved through the corridors like a ghost, someone whose presence required no one to acknowledge her. The employee locker room was on the second floor, past the break room where Miguel and Sarah had Saturday. She didn't see them. Just the grey metal lockers and the dull grey tile and the smell of old uniforms and antiseptic that would never quite wash out of fabric. She'd filled 2.5 garbage bags with scrubs when the employee entrance door slammed open hard enough that the sound echoed down the hallway. Boots. Running boots. Army-issue black leather, the kind that meant regulation and urgency both. Hannah turned. Her son James stood in the doorway, uniform still creased from emergency leave, his face red and streaked, his eyes wide with something between terror and triumph. He was 17 and looked older, hollowed out, but his shoulders were straighter than they'd been before he deployed. Mom. His voice cracked. Mom, they told me, he woke up yesterday, my CO woke up yesterday and he told me everything. Hannah's grocery bag slipped from her hands. One landed on her foot. She didn't move. James, how did you? He told me what you did. He told me who you are. Mom, you were at Ramadi. James held the shadow box like a weapon, like it could change things. The wooden frame was dark walnut, the kind of box that held ceremony. Hannah's hands felt numb. That box was supposed to stay hidden. It was supposed to stay in the storage unit in Charlotte, in the life she'd erased, in the identity she'd burned. She'd never meant for him to see it. I couldn't explain, she said quietly. I know. James's voice was steady now, military trained. I know you couldn't. But they need to see. They need to know what they did. The hallway was still empty, but not for long. The head of hospital security, a man named Victor Reyes with a bulldog tattoo visible under his rolled sleeve and the bearing of someone who'd once carried a rifle in something other than a metaphorical sense, rounded the corner. His badge said Marine, 1989 to 1993. He saw James's uniform first. Then the shadow box. Son, he said, and his voice was calibrated, careful. What's going on here? James opened the box. The medals caught the fluorescent light like something alive. Navy Cross. Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart. The insignia of Senior Chief Petty Officer, gleaming against navy blue satin. That's my mother, James said simply. His voice didn't shake. They fired her yesterday. Victor Reyes's expression shifted, a door closing somewhere behind his eyes. He stepped closer. He didn't touch anything, he understood the weight of what he was looking at. By the time Hannah registered what was happening, Patricia Voss from Human Resources was coming around the corner, Hannah's termination paperwork in a manila folder. The papers slipped from Patricia's trembling hands when she saw the medals. They scattered across the tile floor like confession. Her voice was very small, Navy Cross. She picked up the citation. Bronze Star with Valor. Another citation. Purple Heart. The hallway was filling now. 2 nurses from the night shift. Dr. Chen, who'd sat in the break room while her colleagues left. A patient in a wheelchair, an older man with a Vietnam baseball cap. 3 more staff members drawn by the disturbance. The smell of old paper and aging brass filled the air. James stood next to Hannah like he'd been waiting his whole life to do this one thing, to speak what she could not. Ramadi, he said. Iraq, 2006. She was there. A voice cut through the gathering crowd with the precision of someone used to commanding rooms. Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. A man descended the stairs, tall, shoulders that spoke of tactical gear and 20 years of carrying weight that mattered. His uniform carried the insignia of commander, and his face carried the particular stillness of someone who'd learned that emotions were luxuries for people who got to keep breathing. You're the doctor who terminated her, the commander said, not a question but a statement, and it was directed at Dr. Sterling, who'd just appeared at the far end of the hallway, color draining from his face like someone pulling a plug. Sterling's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Nothing came out. The commander turned back to the shadow box, to the medals still catching light. This woman held a surgical line alone for 11 hours under direct fire in a medical compound that was taking mortar rounds every 30 minutes. 13 Army Rangers came through that compound during a convoy ambush on April 14, 2006. 43 lives total. When her shoulder took shrapnel, she kept operating. No anesthesia backup. No surgical team. Just her hands and what she knew, and the refusal to let anyone die on the floor of a mud brick building in a desert she never chose. He picked up the Navy Cross. This is for that. The crowd had stopped moving. The hallway had taken on the weight of a courtroom. Victor Reyes came to attention. His right hand moved without conscious thought, the muscle memory of salute, fist to chest, held. An older Marine near the crowd began to clap. 1 clap. 2. The sound spread, not slow but inevitable, like water finding channels. Patricia Voss had sunk into a nearby chair, her head in her hands. "I didn't know," she whispered. "You weren't supposed to," Hannah said quietly. The commander's voice cut through the applause. "You're the physician who attempted to delete security footage." Sterling's attorney, who'd apparently been summoned and was now visible near the elevators, stepped forward. "My client has nothing to say," a woman with a federal badge introduced herself as Special Agent Karen Mills of the FBI. Her voice was not unkind, but it was final. "Dr. Sterling, we've been investigating your department's billing practices for 18 months. This morning we discovered evidence of upcoding observation stays as admissions for financial gain. Medicare fraud, approximately $2,147,000. When Nurse Clarke questioned your admission practices on February 18, you initiated a termination campaign specifically designed to silence her before she could document the pattern." Sterling's face had moved beyond red into a shade that suggested his circulation was failing him. "I have an attorney. The IT specialist already provided us with every frame of security footage, including video of you altering patient records in real time on March 2 between the hours of 11:33 p.m. and 1:23 a.m. Jake Morrison, a Marine veteran with a 3/7 unit patch on his laptop bag, stepped forward. "Every keystroke, Doctor. Every file. I saved them all." The hallway had stopped being a corridor. It had become something else entirely. Sterling's attorney was pulling at his sleeve, saying something about bail and circumstances. Sterling wasn't listening. His eyes had locked on Hannah, and for just a moment, his expression showed him the calculation, how he'd tried to break someone, how he'd discovered he'd chosen to strike at the one person in the hospital who couldn't be broken because she'd already survived breaking that had meant something. The shadow box was still open. The medal still gleaming. Commander Price held the Navy Cross with both hands, the way you hold something sacred. "Some people serve in silence," he said. His voice filled every corner of the hallway. "Silence doesn't make the service smaller." Hannah was clearing out her locker when her 17-year-old son James burst through the employee entrance, still in his Army fatigues from emergency leave, carrying a wooden shadow box she'd hidden in her storage unit for 3 years. His eyes were red. His hands were shaking. And when he found her in that narrow hallway outside the break room, surrounded by nurses who'd stopped pretending to work just to watch, he was crying when he said it, "Mom, they need to see these, you saved my company's life and they fired you for it." The box was mahogany. Real wood. The kind that belonged in a house with walls and a future. Hannah's chest constricted as she watched her son open it, watched the fluorescent lights catch the metal of medals pinned in perfect rows. She hadn't looked at this box in 8 months. Hadn't needed to. She'd left that life in Ramadi, left it in a hospital compound taking intermittent fire, left it somewhere in the sand where 17 men didn't make it home. The box was supposed to stay buried. James was supposed to not know. Sacred Heart was supposed to be anonymous. Everything was supposed to stay hidden. But the hospital head of security, a former Marine named Victor Reyes, was already moving toward them. His jaw was set like concrete. He read the rank embossed on the shadow box's velvet backing in a voice that carried across the hallway, down the corridor, into the ears of everyone within 50 feet, Senior Chief Petty Officer. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. That was the only sound for exactly 3 seconds. Then HR Director Patricia Monroe's termination paperwork slipped from her trembling hands and scattered across the floor like confession. Commendations landed face up on the tile, a Navy Cross. Bronze star with Valor. 2 purple hearts. Each one caught the light and threw it back at Monica, whose face had gone the color of hospital walls. A Navy SEAL team leader was visiting his brother on the 4th floor when the commotion reached the stairwell. His name was Commander Derek Halloway, and when he came down and saw the medals arranged in that shadow box like constellations, he went very still. He approached slowly, the way apex predators move when they've recognized something dangerous. His voice, when it came, was steady as surgical steel. That's for Ramadi, 2006. She held a surgical line alone for 11 hours while taking intermittent fire. Saved 43 lives. 13 of them were Army Rangers. Their convoy got ambushed. Medical compound was the only defensible position. He looked at Hannah then, really looked at her, and his eyes filled with the kind of recognition that comes from shared combat. You're the angel. The medic who stayed in the fire. FBI Special Agent Sarah Mills was reviewing Dr. Sterling's department records in Conference Room B as part of the board's fraud investigation. She'd been looking at upcoding patterns for 2 weeks, following the Medicare claims like breadcrumbs, when the commotion in the hallway penetrated the glass walls. She stepped out, saw the medals, and her expression shifted from bureaucratic patience to something harder. She looked at Hannah directly and spoke with the precision of someone who'd just connected dots that shouldn't have been connectable. Dr. Sterling has been systematically upcoding observation stays as admissions for 18 months. Medicare fraud totaling approximately $2,300,000. When Nurse Clarke questioned his admission practices during a peer review, he identified her as a threat and manufactured a disciplinary case to force her out before she could discover the billing pattern. The targeted harassment, the false performance review, the accelerated termination, it was all premeditated obstruction of an active fraud scheme. The hospital IT specialist, a 3/7 Marine named Marcus Chen, stepped forward holding a hard drive. His tattoo was visible on his wrist as he spoke. I've already reported Sterling to federal authorities. Caught him attempting to delete 3 months of security footage from the server room. I pulled every frame before it was wiped. I have him on video altering patient records. Multiple instances. Real-time timestamps. It's all documented. Sterling's golfing partner on the hospital board wouldn't make eye contact. His attorney was texting. His contact at the state nursing authority had already sent a formal email distancing himself. The state medical board will be notified of these findings per mandatory reporting requirements. Any past consultation I provided to Dr. Sterling's department was in good faith and without knowledge of fraudulent billing practices. Hannah stood in the center of that hallway with her medals exposed, her rank visible, her identity collapsing from secret into public with the sound of dropped paperwork and the weight of recognition. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. She looked at James and nodded once, a small movement, military precise, and then she turned to face the room full of colleagues who'd isolated her, supervisors who'd documented her competence as insubordination, and hospital leadership who'd failed their own ethical obligations. I was checking if he was someone's son, she said quietly. Because that's what nurses do when doctors forget patients are human. That's what medics do. That's what anyone who's held a life in their hands does. Her voice dropped lower, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. I knew that unit. I knew those Rangers. I knew what happened to people who didn't get out in time. The room went silent. 48 hours later, the hospital board convened an emergency meeting. Dr. Sterling sat alone in a conference room while they reviewed Agent Mills's findings, $2 million in fraudulent billing, systematic upcoding documented across 18 months, attempts to destroy evidence. Kaufman, his golfing partner, wouldn't make eye contact. His contact at the state nursing authority was already gone, already protected himself with distance and deniability. Sterling's attorney, Linda Greaves, reviewed the evidence and told him bluntly, Marcus, they have you on camera altering records. The best I can do is negotiate the criminal charges. You're looking at federal prosecution. The state board will revoke your license. I'd recommend we discuss a plea arrangement. His medical license suspension hearing came 2 weeks later. Sterling sat at a table while the state medical board reviewed exhibits, the security footage, the altered records, the upcoding patterns, the targeted harassment campaign against the nurse who'd questioned his billing. The evidence was overwhelming. The board chairman read the decision in a voice that carried no emotion. Dr. Marcus Sterling's medical license is revoked, effective immediately. This board finds gross misconduct, fraud, and violation of the fundamental ethical obligations of the medical profession. Within 6 months, the external markers of his life began to disintegrate. His Audi was repossessed from the hospital parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon. His condo listed for emergency sale. His wife filed for separation, citing irreconcilable differences and requesting full custody of their daughter. The text messages stopped coming. The country club membership was revoked. The legal fees accumulated like compound fractures. Hannah, meanwhile, was standing in her new office overlooking Raleigh. The hospital board had offered her a position they'd never created before, Director of Emergency Clinical Excellence. A newly established role overseeing trauma protocols, staff training, quality metrics. When she walked into the corner office on the 5th floor, there was a nameplate on the door. Her name. Her actual rank, finally acknowledged, Senior Chief Petty Officer, Ret. The window faced east, and the sunrise came through glass that had never framed her before. James visited 2 weeks after her reinstatement. He was back on base but calling every night, his voice carrying the specific frequency of a son who'd just learned his mother was someone entirely different than he'd believed. That's when she told him about the other part, about the ranger who'd arrived unconscious that first night, about the tattoo that had stopped her cold, about the unit he'd shipped out with 8 months ago. That was Captain Torres, James said, and his voice caught slightly. My CO. He's awake now. He's in ICU still, but they say he's going to make it. He asked about you. Captain Michael Torres came to her office 3 days after discharge, thin and scarred but moving like someone who'd already learned how to carry wounds. He was Army, hardened, the kind of man who measured conversations in essential words. When he stood in her office and looked at the photo on her wall, a faded image of her in digital camo, younger, standing in front of a medical compound in Ramadi, his eyes went to that specific place. His voice came out steady. Senior Chief, James told me you left the service. I didn't know you were here. In Raleigh. Saving lives in scrubs instead of. He paused. I owe you my life twice now. Once in that compound. Once in that ER. Hannah's composure finally fractured. She stood and pulled him into an embrace while her shoulders shook silently, privately, the kind of crying that comes after years of holding it. Torres didn't let go. He stood there while his commanding officer, the woman who'd held a surgical line under fire, who'd saved his convoy, who'd saved his life twice, finally allowed herself to grieve everything she'd carried alone. She started attending the VA hospital by choice now, not as a patient seeking intake but as a veteran seeking community. She joined a peer support group on Thursday nights, started talking about Ramadi with other medics who understood what it meant to hold blood on your hands in a combat zone. Started healing with her identity intact instead of fractured across 2 lives. Meanwhile, 6 months after his termination, Dr. Sterling was sitting at a folding table outside a strip mall in the cheaper part of Raleigh, selling supplemental insurance policies to strangers who didn't know his name. His name tag read Mark S. A former colleague walked past, recognized him, and Sterling watched the moment of recognition flicker across her face before she looked away and kept walking. He didn't call out. What was there to say? Hannah received a package at her office on a Monday morning. The box was small, nondescript, no return address. Inside were a pair of combat boots. Worn, scuffed, stained with sand and time. Boots that had walked through deployment after deployment. The note was written in Torres's precise handwriting. Senior Chief, these are the boots I was wearing when you saved my life in Raleigh. Same boots in Ramadi when you saved my convoy. Some people serve in silence, but silence doesn't make the service any smaller. Thought you should have them back. Hannah set the boots on her desk beside her framed commendations, now displayed openly. Navy Cross. Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart. The medals that had lived in shadow for so long they'd forgotten their own light. She was leading a training session in Sacred Heart's ER that afternoon, teaching residents the proper subxiphoid approach for pericardiocentesis, her hands steady as instruments, her voice calm and authoritative. Victor Reyes watched from the doorway, arms crossed, nodding approval. Young doctors listened to a senior chief petty officer teach them how to save lives, and nobody had to wonder why her hands moved with such certainty. They could see it in her bearing, in the way she commanded the room without ever raising her voice. This is what true class looks like. What you do when the lights go out. What you do when nobody's watching but you anyway. Subscribe if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true story. Like if you would have saved that ranger. Comment below, would you have kept the secret, or revealed who you were sooner? Thanks for watching.